Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here with my review of the long-awaited Sigma 70-200mm F2.8 DGDN Sport lens. All of us, I think, expected this lens to come years ago, and in fact, after I reviewed their 24-70mm F2.8 Art Series lens, I thought that surely within a few months I would be looking at this lens as well. But Sigma has taken their time, and it's been about 3 years since that point. And I think that there are certain refinements that they needed to make in their technology before they felt like they could release a lens like this, and most particularly when it comes to their autofocus motors. So they've taken their time, and I think that they have largely perfected this lens. And so it arrives delivering GM levels of build, features, autofocus, and optical performance, and at a price tag that is a good $1,000 plus cheaper than the Sony lens, somewhere in between $1,500 and $1,600 US dollars, so that final price point has not yet been announced at the time of this review. But the question is that enough to leapfrog the competition on Sony E and Leica L, the two platforms this will be released on at the moment? Well, the answer is a little bit complicated, but we'll work to answer that question right after a word from our sponsor.
Today's episode is brought to you by Fantom Wallet, the minimalist modern wallet that is now even better with the new Fantom X that is crafted from aluminum right here in Canada. It is 22% smaller and 35% lighter, while still making it easy to access your cards and money when you need them, thanks to their unique fanning mechanism. You could even customize your wallet due to its modular design, with accessories like a money clip, cash holder, ID display, and even Chipolo and AirTag tracking integration. Visit store.fantomwallet.com to check out their unique sizes, styles, and finishes that span from aluminum to wood to carbon fiber, and use code DUSTIN15 for 15% off when you're ready to check out.
Whenever I look at Sigma Sport Series lenses, a word that often springs to mind, or phrase that springs to mind, is military grade when it comes to the construction. Unlike some of the competing lenses, which often the first-party lenses have a white type finish, the Sigma lenses just feel a little bit more densely built and a little bit more as, almost military in the approach. In this case, we have a very high level of build quality. It is a thoroughly weather-sealed lens at all of the significant points, at the mount, at the rings, switches, all throughout the lens itself. And it's made of high-end materials. It's actually a mix of materials, including magnesium alloy. There are carbon fiber injected plastics at some point, and then there are a few what they call thermally stable composites, or engineered plastics, as a part of the design. Their goal here obviously is to shave some weight, because the 2019 Sport Series lens that was released for EF and Nikon F mounts, it was by far the heaviest lens, largest and heaviest lens in the class. That really doesn't fly on mirrorless, and so clearly they had to work to reduce that size somewhat, and so they have. They've shaved off 455 grams, but unfortunately the lens still comes in at 1,345 grams, or 47.4 ounces. You see, the target has shifted during that time, and the new Sony GM lens is significantly lighter at 1,045 grams, so we're talking about 330 grams less. The Tamron 70-280mm G2 lens, of course, is smaller and lighter still. It comes in at only 855 grams. And as you can see from these photos, there is a significant difference between the size of the Sigma and the Tamron lenses. It's almost as if they aren't even quite in the same class of lens. Now, to be fair, the Tamron does have 20 millimeters less focal length, but even when compared to the G Master lens, the Sigma is a little bit larger, as we're going to see in a moment, but also significantly more heavy. Now, part of that is the fact that it does have a really great level of build, for which I'm thankful, but it's also limited by the fact that, for example, here it has an integrated tripod collar and foot. It's well executed in that we do have the detents at the cardinal positions, so it allows you to easily line it up at those spots. Everything works fine, but we don't have a tripod foot that can be removed toollessly. You have to use Allen keys to remove it, and the tripod collar itself, you can't remove it at all. And so you're left with a little bit more weight and bulk, whereas the Tamron's not even designed around having a tripod collar. Now that brings its own set of issues, but when it comes to traveling light, the Tamron clearly is in another class. Now, one of the things that I am appreciative of the Sigma as opposed to the G Master lens is that the included tripod foot here is Arca-Swiss compatible, which is always an advantage in my book. This is an internally zooming lens, and so the length is going to stay constant. The lens is 90.6 millimeters in diameter, or 3.6 inches, giving us back to the common 77 millimeter front filter thread instead of the 82 millimeter front filter thread we saw on the last 70-200 sport lens. It is 205 millimeters in length, or 8.1 inches, and so that makes it about 3 millimeters wider in diameter than the GM lens and about 5 millimeters longer. Now, we have a different type of design here for the lens hood. The lens hood itself, as Sigma lens hood tend to be, is very nice. It has some of those carbon fiber injected plastics here, and then it has that rubberized front surface at the end. I appreciate that. But it's not a bayonet style, but rather the tension knob style, which in my opinion is a little bit more fidgety in both mounting and particularly in unmounting the lens. So I don't prefer that point, but the kind of weird thing is that it obviously doesn't bayonet on the end of the lens and extend out further, so it does help to shorten the overall length with the hood attached a little bit, but there is an overlap here at the back of 3 to 4 millimeters where it actually overlaps onto the zoom ring itself. It's just a little bit of an odd look, almost looks like you've reversed the lens hood for storage. And also, of course, you do lose just a little bit of room there, although the zoom ring is wide enough, I think, to accommodate that. Still, it's a different approach than I've ever seen before, and frankly, I find it a little bit odd. As noted, this is an extremely feature-rich lens, and in some ways it is the most feature-rich zoom lens that Sigma has ever released. We have got basically all the things you could ask for. We've got the focus hold buttons that are replicated in 3 different positions, and so that, whatever position you're shooting in, you're going to have one of those near to hand. We have a bank of switches, including an AF/MF switch. We have a focus limiter that is designed around the 3-meter position, and so that means you can either do full, you can do minimum to 3 meters, or you can do 3 meters to infinity to speed up autofocus. I didn't really reach for it all that often because frankly autofocus is super fast even without it. There is a 2-position switch for the OS, 3 if you include off, but then there's a 1 and a 2, 1 being standard, 2 being the panning option. Underneath that, there is a custom switch. Now here's where we have the first differentiation between the Sony E-mount that I'm reviewing and the Leica L. On Leica L, you have a few more options. You can program some different functions into that custom switch using a lens dock. No such dock exists on Sony for some reason, and so you are stuck with the default positions that are assigned into it. And what that actually works out to be is a couple of more modes for the OS system. And so in custom 1 position, if you turn that on, you have the most emphasis on stabilizing the viewfinder, which is going to be handy for video capture, for example. And then if you go into the C2 position, you actually have where there's little emphasis on stabilizing the image in the viewfinder, and stability is only done at the moment of capture. Gives you really good capture results, but it also gives you a lot of flexibility if you're trying to track erratic movement, and that could be a preferred position for that. But unfortunately, they're not really custom in the sense that you can't change them, at least on Sony. But obviously there's a lot of functions there. Now, speaking about that OS system, this is Sigma's new OS 2 that they released initially with the 60-600mm Sport. And with their new focus algorithms and improvements to the system, you can actually get up to 7.5 stops on the wide end and about 5.5 stops on the telephoto end. That makes this top class when it comes to the performance of the OS system, and it is one area where I will say that this is clearly better than at least the Tamron lens, which I felt was just they call it VC on Tamron. It just wasn't as well executed as what I see here by Sigma. This is the first Sigma zoom to have an aperture ring, and so it's the first kind of very narrow ring that you come to, and they gave it all of the features. If you have it in a default mode, it has the clicks or detents at the 1/3 stop positions, all the way from f2.8 to f22. You can go past that into an automatic mode, but then you also have an iris lock, and so you can either lock into the aperture ring. But if you don't like using an aperture ring, no problem. You can also lock yourself out of the aperture ring and do all of your aperture control from within the camera. And so you have no real disadvantage here for having that aperture ring. You also, down below this bank of switches, you do have a final one that's not all that accessible, but it doesn't really need to be, and that is the option for declicking the aperture, and so then you can smoothly rack through. That's particularly useful for video capture if you want to do aperture racking. So in essence, you have all the features that the GM lens has here on the Sigma lens. So you're really not having any kind of trade-offs when it comes to the actual feature and performance set as compared to the very expensive G Master Mark II lens. Now beyond that, we have got a manual focus ring that is well executed. It is the middle ring here. It is nicely damped. It moves well. There's no visible steps or anything like that. And I will note that ergonomically, I think it's well executed in that the tripod foot can fit into your palm for stabilizing the lens. And that leaves, at least for me, my thumb and my middle finger there where I can do very easy manual focus adjustments, and I appreciate that. As noted up front, we have the zoom ring. I've already noted the kind of the hood interesting things there. This being an internally zooming lens, the zoom action is smooth, though a little bit heavier than some other zooms that are internally like that. But I do have one minor complaint, and that is the fact that for all Sigma lenses, they focus and zoom in the opposite direction, not only of Sony lenses, but of every other lens that I test on the Sony platform. And so it's only Sigma lenses that go from left to right instead of from right to left. And so if you're accustomed to shooting with other lenses, you will have muscle memory moments when you're wanting to go, zoom and you're going in the opposite direction of what you actually want to do, or focus and wanting to head towards minimum instead of infinity, and you'll do the opposite because their directions are reversed compared to other lenses. Now, unfortunately, here is where we get to one of the other Sony limitations. On L mount, you have the options of using a 1.4 and a 2x teleconverter with this lens. But on Sony artificially limits competition by not allowing non-Sony lenses to use teleconverters. So for those of you that are curious, yes, I was able to physically mount a Sony 1.4x teleconverter on there. I could turn the camera on. However, there's no aperture reporting, and unlike in the DSLR days, even if you didn't have autofocus, you could at least manual focus because manual was a direct focus. But in the mirrorless era and focus by wire, unfortunately that's not true. And so I can move the manual focus ring, but no focus takes place because it requires the input from the manual focus ring to run through the focus motor, which it's not going to do with the teleconverter attached. So the byproduct is you can look through the viewfinder, and that's about all you can do. If you need to manually focus, or you need to focus at all, it's just not going to happen with the teleconverter. So in other words, it's just not compatible. And so that is one artificial limitation that we have here. This lens, you're not going to be able to use teleconverters, at least on Sony. Minimum focus distance here varies, as most modern zooms do, but you get your highest magnification on the 200mm end. You can focus as closely as 1 meter or a little over 3 feet, and your magnification level is 0.19 times. So that's useful, but it does lag behind both the Sony GM and the Tamron G2 lenses in terms of the magnification level. Outside of those exceptions, some of which are not Sigma's fault, we have a lens that is GM level in terms of the build, the features, and the overall handling of the lens. It's still a little bit heavier than what I would like it to be relative to the competition, but frankly, it is still lighter than what most similar lenses were back in the DSLR days, so it's not going to kill anybody carrying it around either. Now, when it comes to the autofocus, this is an area I think that is the primary reason why Sigma waited for a while. They, earlier this year, released their first lens with their new HLA, which responds for high response linear actuator. In other words, high powered linear motor. Their first lens equipped with that type of focus system, which they didn't have previously on mirrorless. In this case, we've actually got dual HLA motors, and so that allows for even faster autofocus response. And in my focus speed test, I found that focus was near instant. And you can see the test back and forth, inside and outside, a little bit of slowdown in lower light conditions inside, but still very fast. But in real world use, what I found is that in that first kind of focus acquisition, where you sometimes expect it to take a little while to get there, that focus was pretty much instant. And I noticed how just very responsive the focus system was, as you didn't have to wait for energy to spool up. It just immediately leaped to wherever you needed it to be. So that's great, obviously, in a sport-oriented lens, that the focus system is reactive, it's very quiet in operation, and I found that accuracy was very good. I found eye tracking was very effective. As you can see, stays locked on the eye, and that translates into real-world use. For example, when I did a portrait session using the 70-200, I found that every image in the entire portrait series was perfectly focused. Even when we introduced sunglasses into the arrangement, I shot through foreground obstacles, all of those things, autofocus remained perfect throughout. And so obviously Sigma is really refining the autofocus process, and that helps a lot for something like this. It is also reactive enough that I felt like it could keep up with action. Unfortunately, winter has come early this year, which limits some of my subjects, but I did get Nala to move around for these series, not as fast as what I would like, but she is a cat. And as a byproduct, you can see that autofocus was effective at staying locked on her eye. I wanted something a little bit faster, and so this morning I asked my son if I could just shoot a burst while he was riding off on his e-bike to school. The e-bike accelerates really fast and it moves at about 28 miles per hour, and so it's moving along quickly, and it gives me a little bit more of a slightly more challenging subject. Unfortunately, it began to snow quite heavily when he was taking off for school, and so as you can see in this sequence, Focus did a good job, but did a good job documenting his misery as he began to ride to school this morning. But byproduct is that I have seen enough to see that this focus system is going to keep up with action. Now again, we run into one of those Sony-based negatives here, and that is I did those action sequences on my Alpha 1, which with a Sony lens can do a burst rate up to 30 frames per second. With this Sigma or any other third-party lens, that is artificially limited at 15 frames per second. It's still fast, obviously, but you're not unlocking the peak performance. And if you've spent a lot of money on an A9 series or an Alpha 1 camera, you may want to be able to achieve that peak burst rate if desired. And so obviously that's going to again steer you towards a Sony instead. When it came to the video side of things, everything good to report here. Video focus pulls were smooth and confident. As you can see, there is very low focus breathing, so no issues with that. My hand test was mostly good with just one interaction where it went to the background rather than coming to the foreground to my hand. But for the most part, again, the transitions were all good and confident there. In general, the autofocus performance is fantastic on this lens, and really the only limitations there are ones that Sony has imposed. And by the way, those limitations are not going to be there if you're shooting on an L-mount camera, because it is a first-party lens technically on L-mount. So finally, let's go to the optical performance here. This is a lens with 20 elements in 15 groups, including 11 exotic elements. Sigma took their time with this lens, and it shows. You can see if you look at this MTF chart comparison back to the 2019 Sport lens, that this lens is clearly improved all across the frame, and in particular in the corners. It shows an extremely strong corner performance, even at f2.8 on either the telephoto and then, or excuse me, on the wide, and in particular on the telephoto ends. So let's dive in detail and see if that optical performance holds up to what the MTF chart suggests in real life use.
So let's start by taking a look at vignette and distortion at the 70mm wide end. We can see that there is a little bit of a pincushion distortion pattern and a little bit of vignette in the corner. We can also see even with a manual correction, it cleans up really nicely. That correction is just a -3 for the distortion, very linear and clears well. And then vignette is just a +27, so about a stop in the corner, and that clears up nicely as well. Now at 135mm, you can see that the pincushion distortion is just a little bit more exaggerated, but once again, it is nicely linear and it cleans up well with a +7, and then with a -7 for the distortion, and then a +26, so just a little bit less for the vignette in the middle of the zoom range. At 200mm, we can see that we have a similar type pincushion distortion pattern, and again, vignette is actually a little bit lighter, and so it corrects once again really easily. A -8, so just a hair more of that distortion, but a little bit less of the vignette with a +21 to correct. So overall, that's a really mild amount of vignette and distortion, so no real issue at all. We can see, taking a look at longitudinal chromatic aberration, that there is a really clean transition both before and after the plane of focus. Nothing to worry about there. You can see very little fringing before or after the plane of focus. Here's a great opportunity for some of that longitudinal chromatic aberration, and so we can see that in these water droplets, very, very neutral there. And then as we look towards the background, here's some of these out-of-focus bokeh highlights. We can see again that there's just nothing there. There's no real fringing anywhere that I look, and so that's a really well-controlled performance. Likewise, when it comes to lateral chromatic aberrations near the edge of the frame, you can see there's no correction enabled here, but you can see those transitions from black to white. They're all perfectly smooth, no fringing around them, so a really fantastic job of controlling aberrations. So we'll take a look at resolution and contrast, starting at 70mm F2.8. Once again, this is on a Sony A7R Mark V, and so that is a 61 megapixels of resolution. I'm showing these results at 200%. So this is the torture test. We can see in the middle of the frame, no problem. Great contrast, great detail there. Looks fantastic. If we slide over to the mid frame, similarly, it looks really, really excellent. Panning down here, we can see even right off into the corners. That's a great looking result there. Also, if we just jog around for a moment, taking a look at centering, we can see that there's good sharpness on the left bottom. Up at the left top, it looks great. And then ultimately over at the right top, all around, everywhere we look, detail is really great. So for a bit of perspective, here is the recent Tamron 70-200mm G2 lens. And so under similar circumstances, we can see in the middle of the frame, Tamron has a little bit more contrast and detail there, mostly in the contrast area. It really pops there in the mid frame. Excuse me, in the center of the frame. In the mid frame, the results are more similar, and I would say that the Sigma is giving us at least equal levels of contrast. And down into the corners, they're very, very similar, with the Tamron showing just a little bit more contrast, but the Sigma showing a similar amount of detail. So both really, really strong performances. I would give just a very slight edge to the Tamron there at 70mm wide open. So with such a sharp lens wide open, stopping down doesn't give you as much of an improvement, but we can see here between f2.8 and then at f4, there is a very mild improvement in contrast in the center of the frame. In the mid frame, you can definitely see just a little bit more that's there. And then if we pop down to the bottom, the edge or corner performance is a little bit more noticeable, particularly on the contrast end. You can see the brights look a lot brighter, thus the shadows look darker, and the textures just pop a little bit more. One area you can definitely see that is here on Winston's face. You can just see that there's just a better delineation between the shadows and the light areas on his face. Now from f4 to f5.6 in the mid frame, there's really not a whole lot more to gain there. We've hit pretty much our peak performance, and here in the mid frame, I would say no progress, but in the corners you can see that the corners just pop, and this is now one of the best corner performances I would say that I have seen. Detail just looks really, really fantastic. So for some real-world perspective, this is at 100% magnification, a little bit more normal. But we can see that everywhere we look from side to side, detail and contrast just looks fabulous. And so on the right side as well. And so in real-world performance, you can see this lens really, really delivers the detail. So at f8, you're going to hit the limit before diffraction starts to show up, and so particularly on a high-resolution body like we're testing here. So you can see that f8 looks really fantastic, but by f22, which is the minimum aperture all across this zoom range, you're going to find that diffraction has really softened the image. So I would use f8 and f11 being kind of the practical limits. So from 70mm to 100mm, we can see if we zoom into the center of the frame that the center is roughly similar, maybe just a hair more contrast at 70mm. In the mid-frame area here, we can see it's just very slightly softer than what we saw at 70mm. And into the corners, they're roughly similar, but you can see overall that maybe there's just a little bit less contrast to be had there. In my test, this was actually the weakest area of the zoom range, but you can see here's f2.8 that, again, the performance is still really good everywhere you look in the frame. And so even at its weakest, this lens is really sharp. If we stop it down a little bit, you can see here that the detail is just fabulous. And, there's nothing to complain about there. It just holds up really, really well. So if 100 millimeters represents the weakest area of the zoom range, around 135 millimeters is what I would say is the strongest. You can see in the middle of the frame, that is just popping. The detail and the contrast there is just fabulous, and that's true if we look here in the mid frame. If we look down into the corners, it's just really strong everywhere that we look. And this zone here, you can just see that all that detail, all the little dots of ink that are there making that up, it's all just super sharp, even at f2.8. Now from 135 millimeters to 170 millimeters, we're going to see that there is a similar level of performance, just I would say a percentage or two less at a 175 or 170 millimeter range. In the mid frame, it looks every bit as good, I would say. Looking over at this side, I mean, they both look really fantastic. And as we go down to this area, there's just a little bit more contrast near the edge of the frame at 135 millimeters, but you can see it's really, really close. So even more importantly, we see that 170 millimeter performance is essentially the same at 200 millimeters, and the results now are pretty close to identical, very similar level of performance. So there's no real drop off with this lens. It's not like it falls apart at the end of the range as some telephoto zooms in the past have done, but we can see that right up till the edge of the frame, the performance is really strong, and we've got basically the same level of performance that we had at 170 millimeters, maybe just a percentage behind it. 135 millimeter being the peak, but it really holds its own after that. If you stop it down a little bit to f4 there on the right side, you can see that there is just a tiny bit of boost in terms of contrast and detail in the mid frame. It's very subtle. It's not significant. So, I mean, there's very mild improvements to be had if you stop the lens down, but it's already given you close to peak performance right at f2.8. Again, for perspective, now the Tamron doesn't go to 180 millimeters. It doesn't go to 200 millimeters. It peaks at 180 millimeters. So we'll compare just the end of the zoom ranges. You can see in the center of the frame a similar performance, maybe just a tiny bit more contrast for the Tamron lens. In the mid frame, they are about equal, and then off into the corners, I would slightly favor the Sigma there. You can see it's just a little bit more detail, a little bit better contrast. And so there's some give and take across the frame, but both of these lenses are exceptional performers. I'll give you a secondary episode where I do a more detailed comparison between these two lenses in the future. Now we can see that you get your stronger magnification level at 200 millimeters as compared to 70 millimeters. But one thing we can see is in both cases, you really get a really strong performance up close. I mean, there's great detail and contrast. So this lens is going to be very useful. If you put an extension tube in front of it, you really could have a nice macro lens for the simple reason that it really does resolve those fine details up close. It doesn't lose its ability to resolve when it's at a closer focus distance. So for example, on this shot, at the closest focus distance, you can see just the very, very fine details that are being rendered in the edge of the leaf. That's just a really, really impressive up-close performance. Now, if we back off here, you can see that obviously if you get up close and use 200 millimeters, you have the ability to really compress a background to where it disappears altogether. In this case, we can see, again, it's a fairly favorable ratio. I mean, we've got some objects that are right beyond there, these beech leaves, but as we move towards the background, we can see that everything is really strongly defocused when we get up close to it. Now, if you move a little bit further away, you get a little bit more edges. Zoom lenses are rarely as good as the best prime lenses when it comes to something like this, but despite this being a really distracting background, I actually think it looks really good. You can see that all the lines of contrast look great, and then the transition zone, there's nothing that's really bad there. Likewise, here you can see that from the snow bokeh here, you can see that we definitely do get some of that lemon shape, a little bit of a swirl towards the edges, but overall I think the bokeh quality looks quite good, and obviously it's a great mix of the detail and contrast and then a soft background. That makes this a very nice portrait lens, which is obviously one of the main applications here. So you can see it delivers stunning detail on the subject, even at f2.8. But we can see that in both the foreground and then in the background, the bokeh looks nice. Here's another shot here. And so you can see once again, detail is fantastic and the bokeh is very, very nice. Now, unfortunately, my review period fell during a sequence of nothing but gray days, and so I couldn't use the sun for a flare test. So I used a really bright spotlight and put it right there in the frame. So what you can see is that wide open, no issues at all. Stopping down to f11, you can see a little bit of a ghosting pattern that shows up there. Nothing severe, however. And here's a few other areas right up in the corner, which a lot of times is a place that will induce some flare. Wide open, no problem. And just a little bit of ghosting pattern here with it stopped down a bit. Overall, I would say that flare resistance is quite good. A really strong optical performance from top to bottom.
So in conclusion, we can see that this lens really does deliver. I think Sigma has done a fantastic job because this lens, it really is a strong performer in basically every area. There really are no optical flaws. Autofocus was excellent, and as we've already discussed, all the various build and feature set, there's everything there that you could hope to be on a lens like this. I would say that on a level playing field, it is a near equal of the GM lens. The GM lens, having even more focus motors and having first-party algorithms, might focus just a little bit better. But outside of that, I would say that this lens is every bit as good as the GM lens, but unfortunately it's not a level playing field. The inability to use teleconverters, the limiting of the burst rate to a lower 15 frames per second are going to be factors, at least for some photographers. And there are some that will look at the heavier weight and larger size, and if they want to travel light, they'll choose the Tamron instead. Both of these are really, really good choices. In fact, all three of them are exceptional choices. But the Sigma, I think, does a great job of hitting the middle ground here. And it really provides some clear-cut options on the Sony platform where I'm testing. You've got the Tamron if you want to go smaller, lighter, and cheaper. It retails at about $1,300 right now. You've got the Sigma if you want basically GM-level performance, but you don't want to spend GM money. And so they're at about between $1,500 to $1,600 US. You've got a great option there. And then, of course, if cost is no object and you want the absolute best, the G Master is still very slightly that, with a little bit of help by tilting the playing field a little bit. But it is an exceptional lens that I really loved using, and I do appreciate the slightly smaller, lighter form factor of the Sony lens, which is a noticeable difference from the Sigma. But the reality is that all three lenses are exceptional. And frankly, I think that you can choose an option that best suits your needs and know that you have gotten a great lens and you're really not giving up much. I'm Dustin Abbott, and if you look in the description down below, you can find linkage to my full text review. You can also find linkage to an image gallery there, along with buying links. If you haven't already, please like and subscribe. Thanks for watching. Have a great day, and let the light in.